Hi, everyone. Welcome to our February Book Club Favorites event. This month, we're discussing Camp Zero from New York Times bestselling author Michelle Min Sterling. Today, we're joined by the author herself. We're also joined by our wonderful team member, Elizabeth, to help lead the conversation. Before we get started, I want to let everyone watching know that 3 lucky winners could win a paperback copy of Camp Zero. To enter for your chance to win, just leave a question or comment for us in the comment section of this video, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible live on screen today. And now on to book club. Michelle, thank you for joining us. Can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about Camp Zero?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Camp Zero is set in 2049. It's a near future speculative eco thriller about a group of workers who are drawn to the north, so specifically northern Canada, to kind of conceive of and find a better future. The book is set in a utopian building project that quickly turns into a dystopia as the characters who are drawn to this place find that what they sort of hope for and dream for isn't actually what's actually happening. It follows 3 groups of very distinct and separate characters. The main character, Rose, who goes to work there and spy on the sort of utopian, charismatic and enigmatic architect who's spearheading the Camp Zero project. And another main character is Grant, who is a kind of compromised, idealistic academic who's fleeing his wealthy family and privileged past. And the third narrative is about a group of women called White Alice, who are climate research scientists who live in isolation further north from the camp, and who eventually sort of create a utopia, but become compromised by the world they leave behind. So it's a book really about sort of forging your own future, thinking about how kind of collectivity and community can build a better place, but also really considering our own kind of individual role and environmental accountability as well. And it's a fun read, hopefully.
Oh, it absolutely is. Thank you so much for that explanation, Michelle. I know a lot of people listening will have already read the book, but for those of you who haven't, that was a great rundown, which of course, being the author, you know how to sell it the best way, and it's just such a fascinating story. And it's so unique and original, and yet I know that a lot of it is based on real world things and real technologies, and so I just love it if you could share a bit about what inspired you to write Camp Zero.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Elizabeth. Camp Zero was actually inspired by a trip that I took to northern Alberta to visit a family member who was working in the oil industry at the time. This was well over a decade ago. So it was during sort of the peak period of oil extraction in that region. And I was really interested in what a place that was essentially a boomtown might look like in the future, where a boomtown is no longer. And that became the kind of setting of the camp itself. And so the book is set in this sort of like post-fossil fuel environment, where a group of workers are sort of interested in this place for kind of a future kind of possibility. And so the physical space was very much inspired by like real life, but I was also really interested in how kind of technology mediates our lives as well. And so one of the main aspects of the novel revolves around this implantable technology called the Flick, which is basically a device that is implanted behind the backs of human ears at birth. And it sort of simulates the experience of being online all the time. And I was really interested in exploring what that is, like what our relationship is to being online. We're technically online now. How does that kind of mediate or shape our reality and our sense of place? And how does that change our relationships to like physical land, so like, you know, actual environments, but also each other. And so a lot of the book is about relationships, mother-daughter relationships, relationships between communities as well, and how the physical and the technological kind of entwine in different ways.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, we are online all of the time, and it's you know, it connects us in so many ways, and it's also, there's so much to explore about negative effects too. I love what you mentioned at the end there about all the different relationships in the book, from the mother-daughter to the different communities. I wondered if there was one character that was easier to write for you than others.
So the group of women I described in earlier called White Alice are a group of climate research scientists who basically have been sent by the US military to live in this enclosed community in the sort of frigid north. They go there with the most sort of altruistic of aims, which is to do their work. And they're always, you know, referred to by their profession. So they're called, you know, one's referred to as the geographer, the other's referred to as the cartographer. Like there's a sort of the sense of them being sort of defined by their work. But there's a sort of mystery that exists at this place as well. And as they begin to kind of unfold and untangle what happened to the kind of previous missions that have been dispatched to this station, they decide to take some pretty radical moves. And because of that, there is a sense of like a community that's fostered through these spaces as well. And I was really interested in exploring that, the desire to be separate and what that might actually create, but also the limitations of that as well. So I think that narrative really spoke to me in some ways. It was also really fun to write. I wrote it probably out of all the strands, it came the quickest. And I wrote it in like a large portion of it in one kind of intense, like 4-day writing period, which I've never actually experienced before. But it felt like I was almost kind of possessed by it.
That's so fascinating that a story can, there's like different sections to the story, and then some of them are just like so easy and they just come out of you, and some of them you really have to think about and explore and see how that works. And I know a lot about being on your editorial team. I know how your editing process is like, but I'd love it if you could talk about like what your writing process is like, and do you outline, do you know what the ending is going to be, or does it just kind of happen? Do the characters guide you, or you know where the characters are taking it? Or I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in setting and place as being a way to kind of create character. I think the novel is set in 3 very distinct spaces. So part of the book is also set in Boston as well, and then in Canadian North, and then in this research station. And each of those places had their own texture and their own feeling and their own almost kind of like emotional color to a certain extent. And that was sort of the way in for me, and the characters sort of resulted out of that. And the book went through many different like iterations and revisions throughout the entire experience of drafting it. But the beginning of the book and the ending more or less remained the same. And those were these sort of like dual images I had of these workers, at least a handful of these workers arriving, and then some of them leaving. And part of the mystery was sort of figuring out, okay, how do these 2 particular characters, leave the end of the novel, and what kind of gets them to this point. And so that entire middle section was about kind of figuring out how these seemingly 3 disparate and separate threads would weave together and produce this ending.
Fascinating.
I love that. And that kind of ties into one of our first audience questions from Jennifer, who asked if you're a plotter or someone who flies by the seat of their pants when they're writing. And I feel like you kind of described having the beginning and the ending in mind. But for that middle section, did you really plot out each part of it?
No, I didn't. I mean, I think there was more. I mean, I definitely had sort of certain goals or kind of touchstones that I was writing towards, if that makes sense. But there were less like this particular plot point is going to take place, and more so a feeling of writing towards catharsis. I think because most of the sections of the book take place within these really contained and kind of intense environments. These sort of explosive acts are bound to occur. So I knew that would be sort of some of the kind of rhythm and beats within the novel would be like, how do these characters clash, or what do they create out of the tension? But it wasn't like, X character is going to do this while Y character does that, but more so kind of putting them together and essentially pitting them against one another, and seeing who would form, allegiances or solidarities, and who would come together and who would grow apart.
It's fascinating. You talked a lot about the three big settings, right? The floating city, White Alice, and Camp Zero. If you had to choose between living in one of them, what would you choose?
Oh, it's a tough question. I mean, because I think each of these separate spaces, there's something they can kind of, there are elements of them that are appealing. So the floating city is set in Boston Harbor. I live in the Boston area, so this was something I sort of like conceived of within the space where I actually inhabit. It's a sort of separate city-state that floats on the water, but it's very much, only, I guess, divided in a way from the mainland. And so only those who have connections or, money or certain kind of assets are allowed to live in this space. So, it's sort of low carbon, it's a clean energy kind of space. It's a place where a lot of the climate catastrophe that's narrated in the novel they're sort of essentially shielded from. So yes, there are certain elements of that are appealing, but in order for a citizen to live there, they have to basically like kind of turn their backs on the world they left behind. So I don't know if I would choose that space. Camp Zero, where a lot of the actual, kind of present day elements of the novel take place, is both a kind of bleak but also beautiful and brutal space. It has sort of like naturalistic elements of it, but set within this kind of post-oil world. I think it's the most difficult place to live in some ways. I don't know if I would choose that. And I like the kind of community that forms in White Alice. I think particularly the beginning of the novel, but as the group of women kind of choose to act out on their own terms with their own kind of moral ideology, I think my interest in joining them would begin to fade as well. So there are a lot of like compromises. There is no perfect place. I think that's like what the book is sort of about, even though people kind of conceive of like in a utopian idealistic space, that there are all these kind of, pitfalls and setbacks that exist within in each location.
It's so interesting, yeah, because I was thinking about this question as well, and like each location has its pros and cons, maybe more cons sometimes, but I think the sense of community really like made each location stand out, and I feel like at each one there's unique ways of community, but they all happen, which is interesting. I feel like that's a very human experience in all these places. In speaking of humans and things like that, I know that almost every character uses a pseudonym or is renamed in the novel, and I think that has a really interesting impact on their identity and how they see themselves and how people see them. And could you tell us what made you make that choice when you were creating these characters?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, Elizabeth, every single character uses a pseudonym, except for two. There's only one. There are two characters in the novel who their sort of birth names are used in their first and last name. They both happen to be men, and they both happen to be the most powerful characters in the book. And so I think that, like, just on a kind of basic level, like that's an indication, which is like, what does it need? What are the kind of I guess possibilities that come with being able to expose yourself, to show who you really are, to use how does your name and how do you kind of define yourself or your family legacy, allow you to kind of use your name. And so those two characters are Grant Grimley, who is the scion of this incredibly wealthy Bostonian family who heads to Camp Zero basically to kind of atone for his troubled past. And then Damien Mitchell, who is the inventor of this technology called the Flick. Everyone else is either has a name that has been given to them, or they're defined by their own profession. And there are a series of moments in the novel in which characters are either renamed or choose their own names. And I thought that was like something that would kind of create a sense of like intimacy as well. So like, for example, Rose, who is one of the main characters of the novel, there's a moment in the book in which we sort of learn her true name, which is the name her mother gave her. And that's like a really kind of an important emotional turn in the book where we understand sort of like the larger trajectory of her life and sort of some of the decisions she's made as well and why she chooses to sort of share her name in that moment. But yeah, names hold power, and names hold a kind of sense of realization as well. So that was something I was interested in playing with.
Absolutely. It's an important way that you like identify both with yourself and with the world around you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just want to remind everybody that 3 lucky viewers could win a paperback copy of Camp Zero just by dropping a question into the comment section of this video. We're going to get to some audience questions in a little bit, so drop your questions in now. So when the name question kind of related to this theme of reinvention a little bit too. I really feel like most of the characters are trying to reinvent themselves at some point in the novel. Is there anything that drew you to writing about that process of reinvention and just the concept in general?
Yeah, and reinvention, I think, is something that holds like a lot of potential within a narrative space. If you think about writing fiction, it is sort of an act of reinvention, right? You sort of are creating these characters and inventing these stories and kind of backstories around them in order to make them feel real and tangible within this narrative space. But I was also interested in thinking about reinvention within a futuristic setting. So the book is set in 2049, and it speculates from the present moment and tries to imagine one possibility. Like, I don't think the book is intended to be a prophecy by any means. I think it's really about thinking through a set of problems and challenges. And I was curious to see if there's any possibility of exploration or creativity or reinvention within those pretty limited choices as well. And so I think, Susan, you're totally right. Like, reinvention becomes as a form of a possibility in some ways for some of these characters of reimagining sort of the society and communities they're living in and thinking through different ways that they can kind of create a more just world.
I think that really connects to a question from the readers, from the audience. So I'll shout out to Sandy, and she wanted to know if the novel required much research on your part, and if it was things that you were already kind of familiar with, or you really had to dive into something when you're preparing the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I did a lot of research around like different climate projections, thinking through different, just sort of like the lived realities and, 2049 and what that might actually look like. So a lot of the book sort of centers around the tension of Americans basically leaving the US and going to Canada because they sort of perceive it as being a colder, more livable space. And so that there was like the sort of environmental aspect that I was looking into. But I was also interested in some of the historical precedent. So I did a lot of research around basically like US and Canadian joint projects that took place during the Cold War. And there was one in particular that really caught my eye called the Distant Early Warning Line, which was like a massive building infrastructure project across northern Canada, in which the US and Canada collaborated on building a number of radar stations. And so these are these domed stations on a physical line across Canada with the intention basically of manning these stations to detect whether Soviet bombers are being launched across the Arctic Circle to North American cities. So it was a huge project. It cost huge amounts of money. And when I learned of that, I thought that was so interesting because even in the term distant early warning, there's an element of it that connects to sort of the climate, which is like, what does it mean to to know that something is coming and then attempt to detect it in a physical space. So that was something that kind of appealed to me. But it also made me think a little bit about, living in a physical space that was separate as well. And so White Alice, for example, live in one of these stations, but instead of it being, shut down after the Cold War ended, in my book, I sort of imagine it as continuing, but as opposed to being surveillance against Soviets, it's a surveillance against the climate as well. And so that became like a really important physical space that kind of took on its own narrative possibilities as I interpreted it and sort of read into it in the way that that felt like it worked for the novel itself.
Wow. And that actually links to another audience question from Sharon this time. And she wanted to know if you were planning on writing about climate fiction in your future books, or will you tackle different themes?
I think that climate will always be a part of the writing I do. I don't know. I'm not sure if it will be as omnipresent and as much of a kind of character as it is in this book. But I think to write fiction now is to write about climate, whether it's like direct in the way that Camp Zero is very much about the climate crisis, or if it's more so as a kind of like background or kind of setting or context for the characters. So yeah, I would say that it will always be there. I think in a way, what really kind of drew me to the kind of world building of Camp Zero was the speculative element. And I'm definitely interested in that. I've always been interested in kind of conceiving and thinking about kind of futuristic spaces and what those might look like. So my impulse is definitely still there to kind of, take a set of concerns or set of questions and kind of unspool them into either a distant or near future and kind of imagine characters living and navigating those spaces.
That's really interesting. And it's so true. It's the context we live in, and it's always part of our stories these days. And I also think it's interesting that each reader will take away like a different message. Like for me, like what I loved so much and like it really stood out for me was like that sense of community that we talked about, but each reader will kind of learn something or take something that like really stood out for them. And I was wondering if there's anything specific that you hope readers will take away from Camp Zero. I know there's a lot they can, but
yeah, I think you're right. I think like readers have picked up on different aspects of the book. Like I think the kind of female solidarity and agency in the novel has been like a really prominent theme that was important to me when I was writing, and I think also resonated with some readers. And I think also like the climate aspect too. But I think for me, the book was really about kind of creating the space of like looking forward, and hopefully the reader sort of feels like they can kind of imagine their own sense of the future through their navigation of the book. I think the book kind of opens up a number of possibilities at the end in terms of what could or couldn't happen. And my hope is that the reader is like, well, I think this is going to happen. And that kind of comes up from their own subject position and their own sense of, like contemplating and thinking through what futuristic realities might actually be there. And 2049 was a very specific date that I chose. It felt sort of ideal for the premise of the novel because it was like this mid-century feeling, the middle of the 21st century. There's the sense of like how far have we come? How much more do we need to go? And so I hope that space feels both kind of like tangible for the reader, but also just distant enough that there is a sense of possibility with that too. And so that they can think through, collectivity, responsibility for environment. Is it possible to kind of seek utopian ideals without being compromised? And how do their own relationships to their own community and sort of the spaces they live impact that as well?
Yeah, I think the novel really ends with hope, and there are possibilities and like that the reader can explore, and but there is an after the book in a way, and like the reader can imagine that themselves. But I think with climate fiction sometimes there isn't hope, or there isn't quite like where do we go from here, and I think it's really interesting that the reader can then kind of decide where it goes in their own minds.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I was going to echo that too. I think it's really lovely to leave a story that really makes you think like that, with that sense of hope, and also you have community top of mind and how you interact with others really at the forefront of what you can imagine, which is so important. We have a question from the audience that delves a little bit more into the writing process. We have someone viewing who's interested to know more about the decision to write the White Alice chapters from different points of view.
Yeah. So the White Alice sections are written from a first person plural point of view, which means that they're narrated from this we voice. So it's almost like a Greek chorus. I've never written that way before. I think it's like quite uncommon. Well, I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but it's definitely not the most prominent way of sort of narrating a novel. But it just kind of came to me as I was writing, the sense of like a very strong, distinctive style, a sort of perspective, a point of view that was unified, but also distinguished by these individuals. And I liked the intimacy that kind of perspective afforded me. The rest of the novel is written from like a limited third person. So we are like kind of inside the head of both Rose and Grant, but we also have a bit of distance where we can see them. Whereas the feeling of White Alice is very much being almost like, I would hope that the reader almost feels like as if they're like essentially part of this group, right? But it also kind of touches upon, a lot of these topics we've been discussing, these ideas like collective agency, accountability, where you kind of sense them almost as like a cohesive machine. And so that felt really, really important. There was also a kind of, how do I say this? Like, I think it kind of, I hope that sort of choosing that perspective allowed for some of the twists and revelations to be more surprising too, I think, because there's a kind of couple of reversals that take place in which we begin to sort of see that, this perspective isn't as like solid or as, how do I say this, kind of, reliable as maybe we originally thought of at the beginning. And so that perspective allowed me to kind of play and subvert certain expectations too.
That's great. I always love an unreliable narrator, especially when you don't know that they're unreliable. So you think that you're following along, and then something, you kind of get it turned around and you're like, oh wait, I thought we knew, but we don't. And that was a really fun way to play with that. But yeah, we have a question from Valerie. And she's saying, when Rose spent time with her mom at the cottages, she was visualizing the cottages in Truro on Cape Cod. And she's wondering if there was a place that inspired you to write Rose's past on the peninsula.
Yeah, that's a great connection. I think that the Cape has definitely been, it has a lot of like similarities between the cottages that Rose and her mother work in. I was imagining more like in north of Boston. So either, there's not a specific place that I'm like, okay, it's, it's the specific city or specific town, but there are, also kind of southern part of Maine as well. There are like many different cottages that these kind of seaside communities that exist there. And because I live in Boston, I'm like, I experience the oppressive heat here in the summer. And of course, so many people end up going to these cottages as well. And I thought it was so kind of interesting to think of even those spaces, which are like these motors for the economy, for the kind of vacation rental industry, no longer having the same draw because it's, it's still, it's too hot to go there in the summer, or maybe the season has shifted to the spring, or people like to go there for nostalgic reasons, right? To imagine a time before this kind of this climate crisis kind of really escalated and elevated to the point it is. But yeah, definitely the Cape was an inspiration. Also because it is such a specific, specific geography and like environmental reality of like where it's located to just being like out in the ocean. It's really, really subject to a lot of the challenges of climate. And it's a really beautiful and amazing place that needs to be preserved.
I completely agree. All right, we're just about ready to wrap up. So I've got one last question for you, Michelle. We're curious, what's at the top of your TBR list right now?
Oh gosh, so much. Trying to think right now, looking at my bookshelf. I have actually, I'm actually reading a book called, I'm trying to grab it actually right now. It's too far. Anyway, I'm reading a book called Trust by Hernan Diaz. That's like a historical novel. I just started that. I've been really enjoying that. I don't read a lot of historical fiction, so that's been really fun. And I love the novels of Susan Choi, who wrote this amazing novel called Trust Exercise. So I've been kind of like systematically going through her like earlier novels. So I'm reading a book called American Woman as well. But yeah, I read so much speculative kind of near future fiction while writing Camp Zero that I'm beginning to kind of look at more historical novels now, or like ones at least within the sort of the recent past. And so that's been also really, really fun.
I love that. Trust has been on my TBR list too. I'll admit.
Yeah,
it's such an experience to read it. Like it's such metafiction that like you're trying to figure out what's going on, but you're like along for the ride. Like it's incredible.
Amazing. Okay, I'm looking forward to finishing it.
Well, thank you so much for an incredible discussion. Before we go, I do want to remind everyone watching that you can still post a question in the comment section to be entered to win our sweepstakes. And our next book club favorites read will be Expiration Dates by Rebecca Searle. Join our Facebook group or follow us on Instagram for the latest updates. And make sure you're following Michelle to keep up with what's going on with her. You can follow her on Instagram. Finally, Elizabeth and Michelle, thank you both so much for joining us. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great.